Horrific transformations of beloved characters, shows long forgotten and best never remembered. A creepypasta trend that helped usher in a new age of the genre. I speak, of course, of the lost episodes. The lost episode format of creepypasta was, for a time, the most popular of them all. These stories were better suited to the early days of creepypasta, when there wasn't a general understanding that the stories were little more than fictional horror tales, and were more likely to believe to be true by the general readership. The first known lost episode style creepypasta was Suicide Mouse. SuicideMouse.avi was a video uploaded to YouTube on November 25th, 2009, with the story being told in the video description. The story was told from the perspective of a friend of an assistant at Disney, and purports to describe a video long locked away by legendary film reviewer Leonard Maltin. In it, Mr. Maltin is working his way through a number of classic 1930s Mickey Mouse cartoons in preparation for a DVD collection. At a point, he comes to a cartoon that at first seems odd yet boring, as the music accompanying the video sounds like someone repeatedly slamming their hands on a piano, and it shows nothing but Mickey Mouse walking down a sidewalk before cutting to a black screen. He sets it aside for a time, but upon digitizing the cartoons, he realizes there is more to that particular entry. After several minutes of nothing but a black screen, the video resumes, this time with a now sullen-looking Mickey Mouse still walking down the sidewalk, accompanied by what is described as a gurgled cry. As it goes on, the video gets more distorted, with Mickey's visage becoming more deformed, as well as the background warping. At one point, Maltin becomes uncomfortable and asks his assistant to watch the remainder of the video and transcribe what it details. The assistant obliges, and according to the person relaying this information, a security guard working that night saw the assistant come out of the room, looking pale, repeatedly uttering the phrase, "Real suffering is not known," before reaching for the security guard's pistol and shooting himself in the head. According to the teller of the story, Leonard Maltin told his friend that the last frame of the video was Russian text that roughly translates to, "The sights of hell bring its viewers back in." Suicide Mouse began being shared all over the internet, and not long after it exploded in popularity, similar stories of other purported lost episodes were brought up in conversation. One such story originated on a Suicide Mouse thread on January 19th, 2010, that of Dead Bart. Dead Bart tells the story of a lost episode of The Simpsons, wherein the family is on a plane for a vacation, and while Bart is messing around in typical Bart Simpson fashion, he breaks a window and is sucked out of the plane, and dies. A shot of Bart's dead body is shown, though not in the traditional Simpsons style of animation. Rather, there is a photorealistic sense to the mangled yellow remains. A substantial portion of the episode features the remaining members of the family mourning Bart's death, simply crying. As they cry, the audio gets more and more realistic, and the animation gets more deteriorated and deformed, stretching and thinning and blurring. In the end, the family visits Bart's gravesite, on which his body is resting. Several gravestones are shown with the name of the Simpsons guest stars. Now, this is obviously an extremely abridged version of the story, but you should read the whole version, the link to which you can find in the description. I mentioned earlier that the first known lost episode creepypasta was Suicide Mouse, and that is, strictly speaking, true. However, SuicideMouse.avi is predated by one story that perhaps set the stage for all the lost episode style creepypastas that would follow. It didn't so much tell of a lost episode as it did an entire lost series. That series is Candle Cove. Candle Cove was written in a style that was, at the time, unprecedented, being the first story to use the format that would later become commonplace. It was written in the style of entries on an internet message board, the fictional Net Nostalgia, and focused on various users of the forum discussing a television show from their childhood, that show being the titular Candle Cove. Fictional accounts such as SkyShale033, Mike Painter 65, and, coincidentally, Kevin Hart, shared memories they had of the show and the characters that inhabited it, as well as how frightening it all was in retrospect. The show, remembered as having aired in 1971 or 72, purportedly features the adventures of a young girl named Janice who imagines herself to be friends with pirates. It featured a number of characters who inhabited the titular location of Candle Cove, including the ship Laughingstock, whose bow was a large mouth with the lower half submerged that, quote, looked like it was swallowing the sea, and Pirate Percy, who was noted as having been an inadequate pirate because of how easily he got scared. The show also featured the villain's sidekick, the puppet Horace Horrible, whose face was primarily just a large handlebar mustache atop a set of large, narrow teeth. On top of the mustache rested a single eye with a monocle. The conversation takes on something of a more somber tone as memories of the show's true villain resurfaced. That villain was the Skin Taker. A dirty skeleton whose marionette strings were always visible, the Skin Taker dressed in a brown top hat and cape, and its face contained two glass eyes that were too large for its skull. The top hat and cape are also remembered as having been sewn up in a haphazard fashion, something the posters in the forum take to have meant that the articles of clothing were made of children's skin. The Skin Taker is remembered to have had a jaw that didn't open and close, but rather moved back and forth from side to side. The character of Janice once asked why his jaw moved like that, to which the skeleton looked directly into the camera and said, "To grind your skin." The conversation then turns to user SkyShale033 recounting a recurring nightmare that Candle Cove gave him, wherein after the show's opening jingle, it faded in from black. But instead of the normal show, the camera simply cut to each of the characters' faces, screaming in anguish. The puppets and marionettes flailed wildly, with Janice, quote, just moaning and crying like she had been through hours of this. A disturbing revelation comes when user Kevin Hart remarks that he doesn't think what Skyshale remembers was a nightmare, because he remembers it too. Skyshale insists it couldn't have been an episode due to the lack of plot, which makes Kevin doubt his recollection. But then, user Jaren2005 confirms said episode's existence, recalling the Skin Taker's jaw flailing so wildly that he thought it would snap off of its wire hinges. The story ends with a comment from user Mike Painter 55. I visited my mom today at the nursing home. I asked her about when I was little in the early 70s, when I was 8 or 9, and if she remembered a kid's show, Candle Cove. She said she was surprised I could remember that, and I asked why, and she said, because I used to think it was so strange that you said, I'm gonna go watch Candle Cove now, Mom, and then you would tune the TV to static and just watch dead air for 30 minutes. You had a big imagination with your little pirate show. The surprise, open-ended conclusion, and the story as a whole proved immensely popular. After being initially posted to the horror fiction site Ichor Falls on March 15, 2009, over 9 months before Suicide Mouse, Candle Cove went on to be shared on Creepypasta.com, 4chan, Reddit, the IGN message boards, and more. It also inspired a number of amateur filmmakers to produce their own episodes of the fictional show based on the characters described in the story, as well as copious amounts of fan art, and a pen and paper game developed by the role-playing public radio broadcast. A Candle Cove wiki was also created in 2011 that features character biographies, episode breakdowns, and more information created by people based on STRAUB'S original story. In 2016, the Sci-Fi Network released the first season of writer Nick Antosca's anthology series, Channel Zero, the first season of which is based on Candle Cove. The season consisted of 6 episodes and received generally favorable reviews from critics. I'll be dedicating a full episode to Creepypasta adaptations, which will include comments from Nick Antosca himself, as well as an interview with star of Seasons 3 and 4 of Channel Zero, Brandon Scott, so we'll talk more about that later. After the release of Candle Cove, a wave of lost episode-style creepypastas featuring such episodes from familiar shows like SpongeBob, Ed, Edd n Eddy, and more flooded the internet with varying degrees of quality and success. Over time, the popularity of this style of creepypasta has lessened, perhaps due to the common understanding that stories in the genre are no longer debated as being true. But more than that, the creepypasta genre, like all genres, regularly sees trends come and go. Whether it's rules stories, demon summoning and other game stories, or other trends, they all follow the first, the lost episode, and every lost episode story follows Candle Cove. I was fortunate enough to have the creator of Candle Cove, Kris Straub, answer some questions about his influential work for me.
So when I was little, my brother and I would have, my brother who's 3 years younger than me, we would have summer vacation, no school. My parents were not home. I guess I would have probably been, I don't know, maybe 13 years old, 14, 15, somewhere in there. Certainly old enough to be home alone with take care of my younger brother. But in in Los Angeles, where we grew up, there are two public broadcasting stations. There's KCET, which is channel 28, and that's a traditional PBS scenario. They had a budget, they're doing well, they have fundraisers, the whole bit. There is another PBS. There's another station which I think is located higher up in the valley, like in Palmdale or something. But we could receive it, and that was KLCS channel 58. And so, whereas you would see Sesame Street and PBS Kids and all that stuff on KCET, that stuff, that fare, those things that you would expect a kid to be able to watch on PBS, Mr. Rogers, things like that. Channel 58, KLCS did not have the money. I don't know how PBS works. I don't know why they had a different offering, a cheaper offering. But most of what they showed was like educational film strips from the 70s and maybe early 80s. And it was just kind of outdated. And um, they, they just, I don't know why they ran that stuff. Um, and now we would watch it. It wasn't scary, but it just felt off because some of it was like Canadian. It didn't feel like, nobody else knew about these characters. I remember they did show like Slim Goodbody, if anybody remembers that. Guy dressed up in a unitard with paintings of guts on the outside to teach kids about health. Um, but one of the things that stuck with me the most was it's a show that it was a film strip for classrooms, I assume. I don't know much about it, but it's called Inside Out. And I think it was, judging from the look, it was like late 60s, early 70s aesthetic. And the episodes were only like 10, 15 minutes long at most. And they would present like a moral or social quandary to the viewer, like, a kid making fun of his kid sister, and then something happening and the kid having to make a decision. And the thing about those particular ones, because they were film strips, I believe that the correct context for them was for a teacher to show them in a classroom, show the whole thing to the class, and then because they end on a question, to lead the class in a discussion about what they just saw. And that was your lesson plan. However, when you're watching it at home and there's no proctor, there's no teacher to guide you through this and have a discussion, it's just this weird alien, something weird happened, something bad happened, and you get no closure about it. There's nothing to do. This over, and that's the end. And it just sits with you all day. And I remember that feeling, like that kind of creepy feeling of wanting to watch those along with everything else on that station, which is just kind of odd. It's still there in Los Angeles, and they have a better budget now. I don't know what their programming is like now, but that honestly was the first thing that triggered that in me. So, why did I choose to write Candle Cove in an epistolary format, which is, you know, a short story form. Lovecraft did it. There are a lot of other authors who have chosen this form. It's like you getting to read the letters that are going back and forth between two main characters. Um, why did I write it like that instead of just a story? I think it's because I really enjoy I like the artifact. I like the idea that um, by presenting you with this sort of, I mean, I hate to use the term from games, but like, what is it? Environmental storytelling. Uh, I I wanted the reader to be a part of the problem, a part of the the reader is the discoverer of the issue. Much like when I was watching those shows back then, I was the discoverer. It was my problem. I was confronted with this thing, and it made it so much more personal and scary to like have stumbled upon it. And so I wanted to do that same thing with the story. I don't like the same. I think that so if you have a main character, which is completely valid, and I've read scary stories that have a main character and it's all in the third person, uh, that's fine. But it does remove you from the fear. It provides a distance where all the bad things are happening to that guy, and I would hate to be that guy. And maybe I could be that guy, depending on what the scary thing is. But thank goodness I'm not. And when I put the book down or when the movie's over, I'm not that guy. I'll be scared thinking about it, but at least I'm not him. If it's a story like a forum, like a place that maybe you've visited, maybe you've posted there, it's your problem. You maybe are the protagonist in this story. Maybe it's your problem. Your charge, your task is to solve this mystery. And I much prefer to make that land for the reader or the viewer in case of Local 58. I want them to feel like it's the thing they've discovered and that they don't have the safety of that piercing that proscenium arch. They're a member of the audience. I want them to feel like they're more active. I Some of those characters in Candle Cove, I was drawing upon some of the visuals I'd seen. There's another inspiration for Candle Cove. I forgot about this. Um, so you can find it online, and I've mentioned it in other interviews, but it was an Onion article. The Onion had an article a long time ago. It was titled, I think, it's like Local Man Still Has Occasional Lidsville Nightmare. Lidsville, which is a show I'd never seen, again, early 70s, a little bit before my time. But I guess these two guys, Sid and Marty Krofft, they would do these puppet shows and stuff for kids in the 70s, and it was still like a nascent art form. So a lot of the technical stuff hadn't been worked out. And obviously they're very creative and they're trying to make this show for kids. And the shows are very popular, and Lidsville is one of them. But they are ugly to look at and they're scary to look at. And there is an earnestness about that that scares me, in that, you have this media that you leave your child alone with. You could, you're supposed to be able to leave your child alone with something like Sesame Street. But what happens if that thing betrays your trust as a parent, betrays the trust of a child? And it's like you lied to me. You told me this was going to be fun, and it is not fun. And moreover, why would anybody think this is fun? And so a lot of those shows with that cheap aesthetic, it's like this weird betrayal. Like I feel like the world is so foreign to a little kid that it's a more true version of terror or horror than an adult can fear, where we have our world pretty well defined. We understand things a lot better than a kid does. But it fascinates me, the idea that somebody would think it's a good idea. And some of these puppets, I don't think I was drawing upon any specific aesthetic other than that Sid and Marty Krofft. Krofft is Krofft, if you want to look it up. Other than what's cheap, what would look cheap, and what would look scary. It's not, the intent of Candle Cove wasn't like, we'll make a show that's going to scare kids. It's like, it has to feel like it's earnest, like somebody genuinely believed this would be fun. And then it turns out that it is not fun and the kids are crying. It's like having a clown at a kid's birthday party. God, the clown is a tragic figure. Why would anybody think clowns are good? Even if they're not scary, it's a boring show. It's not an interesting show or fun show. It's so strange, a ritual. It's such a strange ritual. Oh, this is interesting. So, as far as the laughing stock, which is the boat, I do remember that there was a character on one of the Slim Goodbody shows that was a book, I think, and it had this weird little mouth that was not very well articulated, but I think it was a foam, appliance that they pulled down with a string, in the same way that like on MST3K, Gypsy's mouth works. They pull that big mouth down with a string, with fishing line, and it just looks cheap. I mean, it's a way of hiding the it's like stagecraft where they're like, well, this can't look like it has a hand in it, or we can't move the mouth with a hand, it's too small. So we'll do this and it'll look like the mouth is moving. But it's not a total solution, so it just looks bad. It looks like a mouth shouldn't move that way. Uh, I hate to tell you, or maybe I love to tell you, I wrote Candle Cove in about 20 minutes, and it was written a first draft, and it was done, and that was it. And that was the only time I visited it. And there was no development. It just kind of poured out of me. I think that there's a lot of fiction like that, especially online, because there are no editors. You are free to explore and enjoy however you may. But I certainly didn't set about with a draft and a concept and a flow chart of how the story would function. I just felt, I just thought, what would scare me the most in this scenario? What would be the most scary thing at each point? So yeah, there is no other like drafts or characters that didn't make the cut or ideas that didn't make the cut. It was just as it occurred to me as I was sitting there writing. I didn't want to provide too much plot for Candle Cove because it really was supposed to feel like grown-ups remembering a thing they had seen and not being able to recall all the details of until they all are sitting around and starting to assemble parts of it. But I think that if I had been too specific, then again, like I wanted the reader to maybe feel like they had seen it potentially. So the description had to be vague. Even Candle Cove as a name, I don't know where I came up with it, but it sounds a little bit creepy. But I mean, there's nothing innately bad about it. Uh, it's just a little pirates, like a smuggler's cove with maybe some candles in it. It's just supposed to evoke an image, but it wasn't supposed to be like Demon Cove or Blood Cove because that's not scary to me. That's like you're trying too hard. So I think that the more vague it was, the easier it was for people to apply their own childhood to it and maybe potentially imagine that they had seen it. There was no particular relevance to any of these names. Jaren was a guy who was a landlord of mine. Sky Shale was just an exercise in differences. There's just rocks in the sky. Kevin Hart. Unfortunately, I wish I had named it that because I did not know about the comedian Kevin Hart. It is not supposed to be a reference to him at all. It was just a name that sounded like a pretty generic, dumb name. Sorry for the comedian, but it's a pretty generic name. Just random. So Candle Cove initially ran on a um, horror short fiction site that I had for a while called Ichor Falls, Ichor Falls. And it was about, quote unquote, America's most haunted town. And it was a town in West Virginia, which I hear is already a very haunted part of America. But it was very inspired by Silent Hill and a perpetually foggy, clammy, dark, small town. And there was it was sort of a shared reality or a mythos that I was trying to generate. And I wrote a lot of the stories, but then there were some people who submitted stories to the site, which I welcomed. Some of them were excellent, which I really, really liked. But Candle Cove was just one of those stories. So when I posted it, again, it wasn't my intent to make it like a hoax. I didn't want it to seem like an actual forum thing. It was just like in the genre, in the milieu of Ichor Falls and this haunted part of the country, wouldn't this be a scary idea? But it always had my name on it and all that. Every post had the attribution. But what happened was somebody had copied it they posted it on Creepypasta.com, which was a site that was pretty popular, I think, especially with like 4chan, is what I recall. Somebody posted it there with attribution, which was fine. I wasn't mad that they had taken it and put it somewhere else. But from there, it got a lot more eyes on it. And then some people did copy it and paste it to other places without the attribution. So there was no context as, hey, this is a scary story, let's read it. It was just something you would stumble on. So in that way, like it as a intellectual property holder and a creator, that frustrated me because people liked this thing and they had no way to read more of it because they didn't have a way to come back and see Icar Falls and all the other stories I had written. But as an artist, that idea excited me very much because here I had written a story to seem like you had stumbled upon it, and then people were enabling that very thing. And as much as I have been a champion of attribution and creator rights and things like that, I have to say that, like, I mean, once something gets out there, you can't really put a lid on it. All I ever wanted was my name to be on there somewhere, so people knew where to find more of it if they wanted to. But I appreciate from an artistic standpoint how, it let the story function in its truest, purest form by making people think, oh, this is from a real forum. What is this? Is this an actual thing? Was this a real show? I never much cared for the stories that expanded on Candle Cove or extended it. People are welcome to write fanfic as they may, but they tended to focus on stuff that I did not think was crucial to to the story. I liked what I like about it is that it was so vague. So any attempt to put specific points on it kind of gutted it for me, especially when the fanfics and the continuations of the story tended to be you kind of kill mystery. You kill the fear of the unknown by explaining it when you make it the known. And I remember two stories in particular. One of them was the idea that a Candle Cove had been executed by a Nazi in hiding in the 70s in West Virginia. And like, I know that the Nazis are very bad. I understand that. And it's a dreadful thing. They're the worst. They're the worst of humanity. But they also are very symbolic of evil. You can just invoke that, and then it's like, ooh, scary, edgy. And I remember thinking, why that? Why a Nazi? That's pretty of a pedestrian scare. And that's not what I was going for. And then the other one was similarly was that NASA was doing experiments on children for some reason. And again, it's like, well, why was NASA doing that? I don't get it. Like as soon as you begin to put details on it, it dampens it for me. People can enjoy writing them. I got no problem with that. I mean, that's why I wrote it in the first place. I was just having fun. And the world in which I wrote it for fun and nobody cared about it or maybe they thought it was dumb, that world easily could have existed. I only wrote it because I liked it. So I'm not trying to come down on anybody who's trying to extend the story because it excited them. Good for them. But I know that they're writing it for themselves and not necessarily for me. So the story of Channel Zero, how it started, was on Twitter. I was following. I'd occasionally search for the name Candle Cove because I wanted to see who was doing what with it. Because sometimes somebody would say, "Good news, everybody! I'm making a Candle Cove video game. I'm making a Candle Cove. I'm going to pitch a Candle Cove series," and I would say, "You can't do that. That's my property. Like you're not allowed to just take it and run to the network and do that." So I would keep an eye out for stuff like that. And one of the messages was from Max Landis, one of the tweets, I'm sorry. And he just said something like, "Who would like to see me make a Candle Cove feature film?" And I tweeted back at him and I said, "Well, I hope you ask me about it because I wrote it and I own it." And he said, "Okay, I will." So we started to talk about it. And I was very much babe in the woods, terrified of Hollywood. I come from a comics background. I'm a cartoonist primarily. I come from a world where Hollywood says, "I'm very excited about your idea. Here is $200. And then can we buy your idea and then we can make millions of dollars from it?" And you can't. And people say, "Yes, I would love that. I'm excited about the thrill of having my work out there." And then they get $200 and they frown when they see the studio is making a lot more money. And what are they going to do? That's a bummer. Um, so I was super hesitant. I was super skeptical. And also because every treatment or concept around Candle Cove to me, it did go to the pedestrian level where, or what I felt was pedestrian, where it's like, oops, Candle Cove actually is run by a serial killer in his basement, and he's trying to lure kids into the basement. Which is not appealing to me. That's not a story that I think is scary. I really did want it to be otherworldly and ethereal and strange and foreign and alien and sit with you in those ways. And early on, uh, Max Landis understood that, and I appreciated that very much. So ultimately, I agreed to have them buy the adaptation rights for it from me. They offered me a chance to write like the show within a show, like the episodes of Candle Cove. I just did not have time to do it. It would have been really cool to have been able to do that. But once I saw uh, Nick Antosca was on board, I read a lot of his short stories and I thought, okay, well, he very much gets this type of horror. He understands that there's so much payoff in those long, quiet sequences where you just are wondering what you are supposed to do as the viewer. What are you supposed to do? What would you do in that scenario? And it's always been much more frightening to me to consider a distant inevitability where your course of action is not clear. I've never been frightened by the idea of a ghost in a house that attacks you, that comes running at you, because you know what to do. You will run away, you escape, you sell the house, you get out of there. But what if you are living in a house and a ghost is there and then it notices you and then it vanishes? Now what do? Do you wait for it to come back? Do you leave? Do you try to communicate with it? What if the ghost tries to communicate with you and it wants something from you, but it can't describe what it is? And maybe now you're in a position where you could help it. You don't know what course of action to take. That's much more frightening to me. So I did appreciate how they adapted Candle Cove. And granted, they had to add a lot to it because the story, I mean, as written, it would be like 8 minutes long. So if to get a season out of it, they had to write a whole treatment and have a concrete ending for it too, because it is television and we would like to have a somewhat satisfying ending, at least where we begin to understand things. But I appreciated those sensibilities and how they handled it. I think that it was a really about as good as I could want for something like that. I have not considered revisiting Candle Cove or adding to it because to me that's where the story ends, and to add to it, I'm not sure where I would expand on it. However, before Channel Zero came along, I had begun writing an archive of a person trying to research Candle Cove in the form of their notes and their studies and things like that about what Candle Cove was and who remembered it and who didn't. Almost like a documentary type of a thing, or a nonfiction book about it, as if it was nonfiction. But then once I sold the adaptation rights, I'm not allowed to extend it. I can't make sequels technically. I don't own the property anymore. I do have the right to publish the original short story in collections of my own, which is all I really wanted. I didn't want them to own the entire thing, but I can't actually legally continue it in any form, nor can I sell Candle Cove merchandise or other stories or things like that. I cannot adapt the work further, which is okay because in the end, not being able to do that is what made me develop Local 58, which is from the same sort of set of interests, except instead of a short story, it's supposed to be, or it is, short horror online that is supposed to evoke this feeling of watching a high band, small TV station in the early hours of the morning and seeing something that you wonder why were allowed to see this. So I'm appreciative that that I'm not allowed to revisit Candle Cove. I don't know. I would say like the I came across this pretty recently, but I mentioned Inside Out. If you look it up on YouTube, somebody has uploaded a fair number of them. So they do exist. They can be watched. And you should watch them. You should see them. And because that really evokes the style and the creep factor that I was trying to get at in Candle Cove. it's such a strange series, especially if you're 13 years old and you're just thinking about why was I allowed to see this. It's such a weird thing. So I hope it also, like, solidifies the aesthetic of Candle Cove in the mind of the reader, of the fan of it. Right now I'm actively working on doing more Local 58 short horror videos, and I'm talking to people about a larger distribution for that. I started a horror webcomic in 2012. It's called Brood Hollow, and there are 2 books out for it. A third is very slowly crawling uh, into being made, but I'm also speaking with somebody about developing that, which I'm very excited about. And I am primarily lately I am gosh, I just do a whole mess of things. I do a lot of animation. I do a lot of voices. I stream. Just a train wreck trying to describe my work. I create content, is what I do. But most recently, for the past 3 years, I've been doing Dungeons and Dragons live streaming every week at the Penny Arcade Twitch channel. I play a warlock named Kris. It's basically the Cthulhu mythos in D&D, which I enjoy quite a bit. It's something that I can't get enough of that. Oh, and I did run a Call of Cthulhu game at PAX Australia about a year ago, which was super fun. It was the first time I'd ever DM'd anything. I'd love to do it again. These are all things that I do, and you can find many of them at my website, krisstraub.com. And I tend to update people on Twitter, which is also just at Kris Straub.